In 1980, Yugoslavia was one of the most unusual countries on earth. It wasn't part of NATO. It wasn't part of the Warsaw Pact. It had its own brand of communism, its own foreign policy, and a standard of living that made it the envy of the Eastern Bloc. Yugoslavs could travel freely to the west. Western tourists came east to visit their beaches. The country hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics. 11 years later, it didn't exist. What happened in between is one of the most violent and tragic collapses of a state in modern European history. Wars, sieges, mass graves, a word the world hadn't used since World War II came back into the vocabulary. Ethnic cleansing. How does a country go from Olympic host to complete disintegration in a single decade? The answer starts long before the 1980s. It starts with a question Yugoslavia never fully answered. What exactly held it together in the first place? Yugoslavia, the name literally means land of the South Slavs, was created twice. First after World War I, when the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires left a patchwork of peoples without a framework. And then again after World War II, when Josip Broz Tito led the communist partisans to victory and rebuilt the country on entirely new foundations. Tito's Yugoslavia was a federation of 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Inside those republics lived Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Macedonians, Albanians, Hungarians, and more. Different languages, different alphabets, different religions, Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, layered on top of each other across the same territory. This was not a simple mosaic. It was a map with centuries of grievances baked into it. During World War II, the region had experienced not just occupation but internal slaughter. The Croatian fascist Ustaša regime murdered hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Serbian royalist Chetniks committed their own massacres. Tito's partisans fought all of them, and each other. Tito's solution after the war was not to resolve those histories. It was to suppress them. The official ideology was brotherhood and unity. Nationalism was treated as a dangerous poison. Ethnic identity was acknowledged in the structure of the federation, but anyone who pushed it too hard faced the consequences. Politicians who stirred nationalist sentiment were removed or jailed. The system was designed to keep any one group from dominating the others. It worked for as long as Tito was alive to enforce it. He died in May 1980, and with him went the keystone of the entire structure. Tito left behind a rotating presidency, a collective leadership designed to ensure that no single republic or ethnic group could seize control. On paper, it was an elegant solution. In practice, it meant that when crises hit, there was no one with the authority or legitimacy to manage them, and crises came quickly. Yugoslavia had borrowed heavily in the 1970s to fund its relative prosperity. By the early 1980s, inflation was climbing, unemployment was rising, and living standards were falling. The economy that had made the country look like a socialist success story was unraveling. As economic pressure mounted, the federal system that was supposed to balance competing interests started to become a battleground instead. In 1986, a document leaked from the Serbian Academy of Sciences, known as the Sanju Memorandum, argued that Serbs were disadvantaged within Yugoslavia and that Serbian interests needed stronger protection. It was widely condemned at the time, but it signaled a shift in the political mood. Then came Slobodan Milosevic. In 1987, Milosevic visited Kosovo, a province within Serbia with a majority Albanian population but deep symbolic significance for Serbian national identity. A confrontation between local Serbs and police broke out while he was there. Milosevic addressed the crowd and told them no one should dare beat them. It was a moment. It was filmed. It made him a nationalist hero overnight. Milosevic used that momentum to consolidate power in Serbia, strip Kosovo and Vojvodina of their autonomy, and bring Montenegro under Belgrade's influence. Suddenly, Serbia effectively controlled 4 of the 8 votes in the federal presidency. The delicate balance Tito had engineered was broken. The other republics watched this and drew conclusions. Slovenia and Croatia began pushing for looser confederation or outright independence. When those demands were rejected, they moved toward the exit. In June 1991, both Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. The Yugoslav Federal Army moved against Slovenia first. The war there lasted just 10 days. Slovenia was ethnically homogeneous, had few Serbs, and the army pulled back quickly. Croatia was different. Croatia had a significant Serbian minority, concentrated in a region called Krajina. Serbian forces, backed by the Federal Army, seized large parts of Croatian territory. The fighting was brutal. The city of Vukovar was besieged and effectively destroyed, but the worst was still to come. When Bosnia-Herzegovina held an independence referendum in early 1992, the results were clear, but the crisis they triggered was catastrophic. Bosnia was the most ethnically mixed of all the Yugoslav republics. Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats living in deeply intertwined communities across the same towns, the same valleys, often the same streets. Bosnian Serb leaders, backed by Belgrade, rejected the result and declared their own separate republic. The siege of Sarajevo began in April 1992. It would last 44 months, the longest siege of the capital city in the history of modern warfare. What followed in Bosnia was systematic. Bosnian Serb forces, under the command of generals like Ratko Mladic, moved to ethnically cleanse large areas of the country. Muslim Bosniaks were expelled from their homes, detained in camps, and massacred. The scale of the atrocities shocked Europe in a way that hadn't been felt since World War II. The worst single event came in July 1995 at Srebrenica, a town that the United Nations had declared a safe area. Dutch UN peacekeepers were present. Serbian forces under Mladic entered anyway. Over several days, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed. It was the worst massacre on European soil since the Holocaust. International courts later ruled it a genocide. The international community's response to the Bosnian War was slow, conflicted, and deeply inadequate for most of the conflict. European powers disagreed on how to respond. The United States was reluctant to intervene. The UN deployed peacekeepers who had no mandate to actually stop the fighting. It was only after Srebrenica and the marketplace massacre in Sarajevo that killed dozens of civilians that NATO finally launched serious airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions in the summer of 1995. That military pressure, combined with Croatian and Bosniak ground offensives, forced the parties to the table. The Dayton Agreement, signed in November 1995, ended the war in Bosnia. It drew new internal borders, created a complex power-sharing structure, and effectively froze the conflict rather than resolving it. Yugoslavia as a federation was now dead, but the violence wasn't finished. In 1998 and 1999, a conflict erupted in Kosovo between Serbian security forces and the Kosovo Liberation Army. NATO intervened again with airstrikes against Serbia itself. Kosovo eventually declared independence in 2008, a move that Serbia still does not recognize, and one that remains legally contested in international law. The final piece of the old Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro, dissolved peacefully in 2006. In the space of 15 years, one country had become seven. Yugoslavia's collapse is sometimes described as inevitable, as though the ethnic and religious differences inside it were a ticking clock that always had to go off. But that is too simple. Plenty of multi-ethnic states survive. The timing, the speed, and above all the violence were not inevitable. They were the result of specific decisions made by specific leaders who chose to mobilize fear and grievance for political gain. The structural weaknesses were real. The economic crisis was real. The historical tensions were real, but they were turned into war by people who made choices. And those choices cost hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions more. What remains today is a region still processing what happened. War crimes tribunals at The Hague have convicted dozens of military and political leaders. But questions of responsibility, memory, and justice remain unresolved in different ways across every successor state. Bosnia still operates under the complicated architecture of Dayton, a system designed to end a war, not to build a functioning country. Yugoslavia disappeared because the system holding it together depended on conditions that couldn't last. A single dominant leader, a Cold War framework that made unity useful, and an economy healthy enough to keep resentments manageable. When all three collapsed at once, the country had no foundation left to stand on. It is a warning about what happens when political systems paper over divisions instead of addressing them, and about how quickly the unthinkable can become reality, not over centuries, but over years.